The council chambers of the galactic unity hung suspended in the darkness of space, a massive ring of gleaming metal and transparent aluminum that housed the representatives of 47 species. Inside the main assembly hall, Ambassador Chen Wei sat motionless in the human delegation's seat, her hands folded carefully on the polished surface before her. She had stopped listening to the Vicarian speaker 3 minutes ago. The translator in her ear continued its work, converting the clicking and whistling sounds into standard galactic. But the words had become meaningless. They were discussing quotas again. Trade quotas, resource allocation percentages, the proper distribution of mining rights in the Kepler system. Chen Wei wanted to scream. 48 hours ago, the colony on Harvest Moon had gone silent. 23,000 human souls, gone in an instant. The initial reports suggested a malfunction in the atmospheric processors, but Chen Wei had seen the classified briefing that morning. She knew the truth. The Zetharian collective had attacked without warning, without provocation, and without mercy. They had bombarded the colony from orbit until nothing remained but scorched earth and ash. When she had requested an emergency session to address the massacre, the council had scheduled it for 2 weeks from now. Too many other matters required attention first, they said. Proper procedures must be followed, they insisted. The Zetharian representative had not even bothered to attend today's regular session. Chen Wei's communication implant vibrated softly against her temple. A message from Earth, marked urgent and encrypted at the highest level. She excused herself quietly and made her way to the human embassy's secure room, a windowless box lined with signal-dampening materials that the other species found paranoid and excessive. Director Sarah Okonkwo's face appeared on the screen, her expression carved from stone. She had aged 10 years in the past 2 days, new lines etched deep around her eyes and mouth. Ambassador Chen, I'm authorizing you to recall all human personnel from Council space. You have 72 hours to evacuate our embassies, trade posts, and observation stations. After that window closes, any humans remaining in Council territory do so at their own risk. Chen Wei felt her stomach drop. Director, with respect, if we withdraw now, we lose any chance of diplomatic resolution. The Council will convene the emergency session in 2 weeks. Okonkwo's voice could have frozen hydrogen. While they debate proper procedures and draft strongly worded statements, how many more colonies do we lose? How many more children die while we wait for the Council to find a convenient time slot in their schedule? What are you planning? Not me, Ambassador. The decision came from higher up. Much higher. Okonkwo leaned forward, her eyes burning with an intensity that made Chen Wei want to look away. Humanity tried playing by their civilized rules. We joined their council. We adopted their conventions on warfare. We limited our weapons, restricted our tactics, and accepted their definitions of acceptable conduct. And what did that get us? 23,000 dead on Harvest Moon. The Zetharians spit on those rules, and the council does nothing. Chen Wei's mouth had gone dry. What are we going to do? We're going back to human rules, the old ones, the ones we used before we met the galaxy and learned to be civilized. Okonkwo's smile was terrible to witness. Humanity is very good at those rules, Ambassador. We practiced them for thousands of years before we reached the stars. The galaxy is about to remember why our species survived when everything on Earth was trying to kill us. The screen went dark. Chen Wei stood alone in the secure room, her hands trembling. She thought of her daughter on Mars, safe in the inner system. She thought of the 23,000 who would never go home. She thought of the Vicarian still droning on about trade quotas in the assembly hall, completely unaware that the universe had just shifted on its axis. She began drafting the evacuation orders. Across the galaxy, in the Zetharian home system, High Commander Zelthar received the casualty reports from Harvest Moon with satisfaction. The human colony had been eliminated with minimal expenditure of ammunition and 0 Zetharian losses. The operation had served its purpose perfectly, demonstrating to the Council and the other species that humanity's protection under galactic law was meaningless when push came to shove. The humans would protest, of course. They would file complaints and demand investigations. The Council would form committees and subcommittees, schedule hearings and draft reports. The process would take months, possibly years. By then, the collective would have secured mining rights to 6 more resource-rich systems that the humans currently claimed. It was simply good business. Zelthar's second-in-command, a younger officer named Krath, approached his command chair with some hesitance. "Hi, Commander. Our intelligence division has detected unusual activity in human space. Multiple fleet elements are moving away from their regular patrol routes. Civilian vessels are being recalled to their inner colonies." Fear response. Zelthar made the Zatharian gesture of dismissal, a complex motion involving 3 of his 4 arms. "They're consolidating their population centers, expecting further attacks. Let them cower behind their planetary shields. We've made our point." "With respect, High Commander, the pattern suggests something else. The fleet movements aren't defensive in nature." "They're converging." "Converging where?" Krath brought up a holographic display of the local stellar neighborhood. Red markers indicated Zatharian holdings. Blue showed human territories. And there, at the edge of both spheres of influence, multiple blue markers were gathering in a system with no planets, no resources, and no strategic value. "That's the Thresh system," Zelthar said slowly. "Empty space. Why would they mass forces there?" "Unknown, High Commander, but the concentration is significant. Our analysts estimate 40% of the human navy is either in that system or en route to it." Zelthar felt a tickle of unease, which he immediately suppressed. The humans were a young species, barely 2 centuries into their space age. Their technology was adequate, but not exceptional. Their military had never been tested in a real war, only minor skirmishes and peacekeeping operations under Council oversight. They followed the Council's rules of engagement, limiting themselves to non-lethal force whenever possible and treating prisoners according to established conventions. "Maintain surveillance on the Thresh system," he ordered. "But our defensive posture remains unchanged. The humans lack the capability to threaten our core worlds, and they lack the will to break Council law with aggressive action. They'll make noise, file protests, and eventually accept whatever settlement the Council negotiates on their behalf." Krath acknowledged the order and withdrew, but the unease remained, a small, cold spot in Zelthar's gut that he couldn't quite rationalize away. The evacuation of Council space proceeded with remarkable efficiency. Human cargo haulers, usually slow and plodding vessels designed for maximum capacity rather than speed, suddenly began moving with military precision. Trade outposts that had operated for decades shut down overnight, their equipment carefully packed and loaded. Embassy staff who had spent years building relationships and negotiating treaties departed without fanfare or explanation. The other Council species watched with confusion and growing alarm. The Vacarans, who depended on human-manufactured electronics for half their industrial base, suddenly found their supply chains disrupted. The Kelthans, who had contracted human security firms to patrol their merchant lanes, received brief notifications that all contracts would be terminated within 48 hours. Ambassador Chen Wei was one of the last to leave. She stood in the empty embassy, the walls bare of the artwork and cultural displays that had made the space feel like home. Her assistant, a young man named Marcus, who had been born on Titan, hovered nearby with a portable scanner, running one final check for classified materials. "That's it, Ambassador. We're clean." Chen Wei took one last look around the reception hall, where she had hosted countless diplomatic functions, where she had convinced skeptical alien officials that humanity deserved a place in galactic civilization, where she had worked tirelessly to build bridges between Earth and the stars. "Let's go home, Marcus." Their shuttle lifted away from the Council station 90 minutes later, joining the stream of human vessels fleeing toward the inner systems. Through the viewport, Chen Wei could see the massive ring of the council chambers, still brightly lit and busy with its endless meetings and debates. She wondered if they had noticed yet. She wondered if they cared. The secure channel crackled to life with Director Okonkwo's voice. All human personnel are clear of council space. I repeat, all personnel are clear. Ambassador Chen, you're cleared to release the prepared statement. Chen Wei activated the wideband transmission that would reach every species in the council simultaneously. Her message was brief, just 3 sentences long, but she had spent hours perfecting the wording. The Human Alliance formally withdraws from the Galactic Council, effective immediately. We no longer recognize Council authority over human affairs or human territory. We will deal with threats to humanity according to our own judgment and our own methods. She closed the channel and sat back in her seat. Marcus was staring at her with something between awe and terror. "What have we done?" he whispered. "We've reminded the galaxy who we are," Chen Wei replied, "and what we're capable of when you push us too far." In the Thresh system, Admiral James Hawthorne stood on the bridge of the UHS Indomitable, watching the tactical display as the last elements of his fleet dropped out of faster-than-light transit. 42 capital ships, 115 cruisers, 347 destroyers, and support vessels too numerous to count efficiently. The largest single concentration of human military power ever assembled in one location. His executive officer, Commander Patricia Lee, moved to his side. "All ships report ready status, Admiral. We can begin the jump to Zetharian space on your order." Hawthorne nodded slowly, his eyes on the display. Somewhere in his mind, a voice that sounded like his academy instructors was shouting at him about council law, rules of engagement, proportional response. He told that voice to shut up. "All ships, this is Admiral Hawthorne. In approximately 10 minutes, we will execute a coordinated jump directly into Zetharian core space. Our target is their primary military shipyard at Zelkara Station. Under normal circumstances, I would now brief you on council rules of engagement, on the importance of minimizing casualties and treating enemy combatants with dignity and respect." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to tell you about a girl named Sarah Chen. She was 7 years old, living on Harvest Moon with her parents. She liked to paint pictures of the sunsets on that colony. She wanted to be a xenobiologist when she grew up. The Zetharians killed her 2 days ago, along with 23,000 others." His voice hardened. "The council would have us file reports and wait for committees. They would have us trust in their justice system, even though the Zetharians face no consequences for what they've done. I say we're done trusting the council. I say we're done playing by rules that only apply to us. The Zetharians want to know what humanity is capable of when we're not bound by civilized conventions. They're about to find out." He turned to Commander Lee. "Sound general quarters, all weapons free. When we arrive at Zelkara, there will be no warnings, no surrender demands, no quarter asked or given. We go in fast, we hit hard, and we don't stop until that station is nothing but debris." "Aye, Admiral," Lee replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to do. Hawthorne looked out at the fleet one more time. All those ships holding all those people who had volunteered to cross a line that humanity had never crossed before. They were about to become something the galaxy had never seen. Humans unbound by their own restraint, operating according to the brutal logic that had carried their species through ice ages and predators and wars that consumed entire continents. The galaxy called them a young species, barely civilized, playing at being equals among ancient and sophisticated cultures. The galaxy was about to learn a hard truth. Humanity had always been civilized. They had simply chosen to be, and they could choose to stop. "All ships," Hawthorne said quietly. Execute jump. The stars twisted, reality bent, and 900 human warships vanished from the Thresh system, leaving behind only the fading signature of their departure. They would arrive at Zelkara Station in 7 minutes. In those 7 minutes, the galaxy's understanding of humanity would change forever. Station Commander Velkath was reviewing supply manifests when reality tore open just outside Zelkara Station's primary docking array. The spatial distortion warning came first, a shrill alarm that meant incoming faster-than-light arrivals. Standard procedure called for identifying the vessels and clearing approach vectors, a routine that Velkath had performed thousands of times over his 20-year career managing the collective's largest military construction facility. The sensor operator's voice carried confusion rather than alarm. "Commander, we're reading multiple transit signatures. Very multiple. Counting 200 contacts. No, 300. Still climbing." Velkath moved to the main display, his primary eyes widening as the sensor data resolved into something impossible. Ships were materializing from faster-than-light transit in tight formation, a maneuver that required extraordinary coordination and computational power. The collective's own fleet could barely manage jumps of 10 ships simultaneously without dangerous drift errors. Identification? The operator's mandibles clicked nervously. "Transponders are broadcasting human registry." "Commander, but that can't be right. The entire human navy couldn't field this many capital ships." "Battle stations," Velkath said, his voice automatically calm even as his mind raced through scenarios. "Raise shields. Prime all defensive batteries. Send a priority alert to Fleet Command and demand an explanation from the human vessels. There must be some mistake." The communications officer began transmitting standard queries and warnings, but Velkath could already see the problem developing on tactical. The human ships weren't slowing or adjusting course. They were accelerating, spreading out into attack formations that looked nothing like the careful defensive patterns that Council military doctrine prescribed. "Commander, the human vessels are arming weapons. Multiple targeting locks detected." "They wouldn't dare," Velkath heard himself say. "Council law forbids first strike actions. They'll be sanctioned, expelled from all civilized space if they—" The first missile salvo turned his words into ash. 300 human ships opened fire simultaneously, and the space around Zelkara Station became a storm of plasma and kinetic projectiles. The station's shields, designed to withstand debris impacts and the occasional accident, collapsed under the assault in less than 8 seconds. Velkath watched in frozen horror as entire sections of his station simply ceased to exist. The humans weren't targeting military hardpoints or attempting surgical strikes on critical systems. They were destroying everything, methodically working through the massive structure with a thoroughness that spoke of careful planning and absolute commitment. "Get evacuation pods away!" he managed to shout over the cacophony of alarms and explosions. "All personnel to emergency stations. Send a distress signal to any collective forces in range." But even as he gave the orders, Velkath knew they were meaningless. The human fleet had positioned elements to intercept any escape vectors. Pods that managed to launch were being tracked and destroyed by point defense systems with mechanical efficiency. The humans weren't leaving survivors. They weren't taking prisoners. They were erasing Zelkara Station and everyone on it from existence. The main reactor breach warning came 90 seconds into the attack. Velkath looked around his command center at the officers who had served under him, some for over a decade. He saw fear in their eyes and something else, the dawning realization that the young, civilized species they had dismissed as barely worthy of council membership was capable of this. The humans had learned the galaxy's rules, had followed them faithfully for 200 years, and everyone had assumed that meant something fundamental about their nature. The assumption had been wrong. The reactor went critical, and Station Commander Velkath had just enough time to understand the magnitude of that error before the explosion vaporized his command center and everything in it. Admiral Hawthorne watched the tactical display with the detachment of a surgeon performing a necessary operation. The destruction of Zelkara Station was proceeding exactly according to plan. His fleet had caught the Zatharians completely unprepared, their defensive systems never designed to handle an all-out assault from a force this size. The station had lasted less than 2 minutes before its main structure collapsed. "Admiral, we're detecting a Zatharian patrol group entering sensor range. 6 heavy cruisers, likely responding to the station's distress signal." "Intercept and destroy," Hawthorne said flatly. "No survivors. No wreckage large enough to recover data cores." Commander Lee executed the order without hesitation, directing a squadron of destroyers to meet the incoming Zatharians. The ensuing engagement lasted 43 seconds. The human vessels used tactics that the Council had explicitly banned in their rules of warfare: coordinated kill boxes, overwhelming force concentration, and the systematic destruction of escape pods and damaged vessels that tried to surrender. The Zatharian cruisers had expected a proper military engagement with opportunities to yield, to negotiate, to fall back to defensive positions. Instead, they encountered something that fought like the predator species of Earth's ancient past: fast, vicious, and utterly without mercy. Hawthorne's communication panel lit up with an incoming transmission from Earth. Director Okonkwo's face appeared, with several other figures visible in the background, people whose positions were classified high enough that their faces had been digitally obscured. "Admiral Hawthorne, Zelkara's destruction has been confirmed by our intelligence assets. The Galactic Council has issued an emergency condemnation and is demanding your immediate surrender." "I'm sure they are," Hawthorne replied. "What are my actual orders, Director?" One of the shadowed figures leaned forward. The voice was male, older, carrying the kind of authority that came from the very top of Earth's government. "You are to continue operations according to Plan Prometheus. The Council has had 200 years to protect human interests through diplomacy and law. They failed. Now they can watch us protect ourselves through methods they claim to find barbaric." "Understood, sir. What about Council member species with no involvement in the Harvest Moon attack?" "Your operations are limited to Zatharian holdings and military assets. However, any Council species that attempts to intervene militarily will be treated as hostile. Make that absolutely clear in any communication." The transmission ended. Hawthorne looked at the tactical display where his fleet was already repositioning for the next target. Plan Prometheus called for hitting 6 major Zatharian military installations in rapid succession, then withdrawing before the Council could organize a response force. The goal wasn't to conquer territory or force a surrender. The goal was to make a statement that would echo across every species in the galaxy. Humanity was no longer playing by rules that only applied to them. "All ships, prepare for jump to target Beta. We maintain radio silence until we're in position. Execute in 5 minutes." The UHS Indomitable's bridge crew moved with practiced efficiency, but Hawthorne could see the tension in their faces. They all understood what they were doing, what line they were crossing. These were professional military officers who had trained their entire careers to follow regulations and honor the Council's carefully constructed framework for civilized warfare. Now they were being ordered to throw all of that away and fight like their ancestors had fought, before humanity reached the stars and learned to moderate their violence. Some of them would struggle with the moral implications of what they were doing. Some would find justification in the ashes of Harvest Moon and the 23,000 innocents who had died there. And some would simply follow orders, trusting that the people above them in the chain of command understood something they didn't. Hawthorne envied none of them their thoughts tonight. He knew he would carry the memory of Zelkara Station's destruction for the rest of his life, however long or short that might be. The screams on the emergency channels, the futile surrender attempts, the escape pods that his ships had methodically eliminated, all of it would stay with him. But so would the faces of the children who had died on Harvest Moon while the galaxy's civilized rules did nothing to protect them. "Jump in 30 seconds," Commander Lee announced. The stars twisted again, and 900 human warships vanished from Zetharian space, leaving behind only debris and the kind of silence that follows apocalyptic violence. In the council chambers, the emergency session had devolved into chaos. Ambassador Tvek of the Vicarian delegation was attempting to speak over the shouting of 40 other species representatives, all demanding action, explanations, or protection from the humans who had suddenly revealed themselves to be far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The Zetharian representative, a diplomat named Shelthar, who had inherited his position just hours earlier when the previous ambassador suffered a complete nervous collapse, stood before the assembly with his species' traditional posture of dignified outrage. The human attack was unprovoked and in direct violation of unprovoked? The interruption came from Ambassador Chen Wei, who had returned to the council station on her own initiative against orders from Earth. She stood in the human delegations area, no longer wearing her diplomatic robes, but instead a simple jumpsuit that carried no rank or designation. "You murdered 23,000 civilians on Harvest Moon. You bombed them from orbit without warning. That seems pretty provocative to me." "That was a regrettable accident during a territorial dispute," Shelthar began, but Chen Wei cut him off with a laugh that held no humor. "Accident? You accidentally deployed your entire Third Fleet to orbit a civilian colony. You accidentally armed every bombardment weapon on those ships. You accidentally fired on population centers until nothing was left alive. What an incredible series of accidents." Tvek managed to restore some semblance of order. "Ambassador Chen, regardless of the circumstances surrounding Harvest Moon, the human response has been disproportionate and outside all accepted bounds of military action. The Council demands that Earth recall its fleet immediately and submit to a full investigation of these war crimes." Chen Wei looked around the assembly hall, seeing the same faces she had worked with for years. Some looked angry, some frightened, some self-righteously indignant. None of them looked like they understood what had changed. "Let me make something clear," she said, speaking slowly and carefully so the translators could keep up. "Earth didn't recall me to this station. I came back on my own because I thought maybe, just maybe, someone here needed to hear this directly. Humanity is done with the Council. We're done with your rules that seem to only apply when it's convenient for the established powers. We're done trusting in galactic justice that moves at the speed of bureaucracy while our people die." "Then you're declaring yourselves outlaws," Shelthar said. "Pirates and criminals without the protection of civilized law." "No," Chen Wei replied. "We're declaring ourselves independent. You don't get to define what civilized means anymore. You created a system where species like the Zetharians can commit atrocities and then hide behind committees and procedures while their victims wait for justice that never comes. We tried it your way for 2 centuries. Now we're going back to our way." "Your way is barbarism," Tvek said, but his voice carried uncertainty now. "Unrestrained violence without rules or limits. Our way is survival," Chen Wei corrected. "Humanity spent hundreds of thousands of years learning how to survive on a planet that was actively trying to kill us. We learned from predators and ice ages and plagues and each other. We learned to be very, very good at violence when violence was necessary. Then we went to the stars and met you, and you taught us to be civilized. You taught us restraint and proportion and proper procedure." She paused. "We appreciate the lesson. It was valuable. But you also taught us that civilized rules only matter when everyone follows them. The Zetharians decided not to follow the rules, so neither will we." The assembly hall fell silent. Chen Wei could see the calculations happening behind every set of eyes, every species representative suddenly reassessing what humanity meant for the galactic balance of power. They had been comfortable with humans as junior members of the Council, restricted by rules and conventions, their military power held in check by the threat of sanctions and expulsion. But humanity outside the Council, unbound by those restrictions, drawing on military doctrines that predated their contact with alien species, that was a different equation entirely. "The Council will respond with force if necessary," Tvek said, but he didn't sound confident. "We cannot allow rogue species to operate without oversight." "Then you'll have a war," Chen Wei said simply. "And I strongly suggest you think very carefully about that decision. You've seen what one human fleet can do when we're not worried about following your rules. We have 8 more fleets in reserve, and Earth's industrial base has been building warships for 2 centuries without ever really needing to use them in serious combat. Every ship in our Navy is crewed by professionals who train to fight according to your civilized doctrine. But every one of those crews is also human, and buried in our cultural memory are thousands of years of very uncivilized warfare. Wars where we bombed cities flat, where we poisoned water supplies, where we developed weapons specifically designed to cause maximum suffering. We put all of that aside when we joined you among the stars. We can take it back out if you force us to." She turned to leave, then paused at the chamber entrance. "The Council has 2 weeks to censure the Zetharians for the Harvest Moon Massacre and pay reparations to the victims' families. If that doesn't happen, Admiral Hawthorne has orders to continue his operations. And believe me when I tell you, Zelkara Station was him being gentle. You really don't want to see what humans consider harsh." The door closed behind her, leaving 46 species representatives in stunned silence. Finally, the Velnari ambassador, an elderly being who had served on the Council longer than some species had been spacefaring, spoke into the quiet. "I warned the Council 3 decades ago that humanity was not like other young species. They adapt too quickly. They learn too well. They have too much capacity for both creation and destruction. I said then that we should either fully integrate them into the Council structure or maintain careful distance. Instead, we treated them as useful but ultimately negligible partners. We have, I fear, made a catastrophic miscalculation." "What do you suggest?" Tvek asked. "I suggest we do exactly what Ambassador Chen demanded. The Zetharians committed an atrocity. They should face consequences. If we fail to deliver justice through civilized means, the humans will deliver it through uncivilized ones. And based on what we've seen so far, I do not believe the galaxy is prepared for what that actually means." High Commander Zelthar stood in the emergency command center buried 3 kilometers beneath the surface of the Zetharian homeworld. The primary military headquarters had been evacuated 6 hours earlier, after intelligence suggested the humans might target it in their next strike. Around him, officers moved with controlled panic, trying to coordinate a defense against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The tactical display showed the devastation with brutal clarity. Zelkara Station gone, the shipyards at Velmoth destroyed, 3 frontier outposts eliminated, 2 patrol fleets wiped out when they attempted to intercept the human task force. In less than 48 hours, humanity had inflicted more damage on the collective than the last 3 wars combined. "Status of the home fleet?" Zelthar demanded. "Repositioned to orbital defense pattern around the homeworld," his operations officer reported. 230 ships, all capital class or larger. We've also activated the planetary defense grid. If the humans come here, they'll face the strongest defensive position in collective space." "They won't come here," Zelthar said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "They're not trying to conquer us. They're making a statement. Every target they've hit has been military and infrastructure. They're systematically dismantling our ability to project force while avoiding civilian casualties." Krath looked up from his station. "High Commander, that doesn't match their actions at Zelkara. 12,000 Zetharians died when that station was destroyed, many of them civilian contractors and support personnel. Because they didn't have time to evacuate, not because the humans targeted them specifically," Zelthar replied. If humanity wanted to match what we did at Harvest Moon, they could have glassed one of our colony worlds from orbit. Instead, they're hitting military targets. They're showing restraint, even while demonstrating that they could choose not to. That makes them more dangerous, Krath said quietly. A berserker enemy. You can predict. They'll come straight at you, trying to kill everything. But an enemy who's angry enough to break every rule, yet disciplined enough to pick their targets carefully, that's an enemy who has control over their violence. That's an enemy who's making a calculated decision to hurt us just enough to make a point. Zelthar felt cold certainty settling into his bones. The humans had spent 2 centuries observing how the Council functioned, learning the unwritten rules that governed galactic politics. They understood that mass civilian casualties would unite the other species against them. But military targets? Strategic strikes against the very forces that had committed the Harvest Moon atrocity? That was a much harder case to sell to the Council as requiring intervention. Get me a secure channel to the Council, Zelthar ordered. It's time to negotiate. The Collective does not negotiate with criminals and terrorists, one of the senior officers protested. The Collective is about to lose a war it started by accident and continued through pride, Zelthar snapped. We thought we could take human territory without consequences because they were weak and their Council allies wouldn't defend them strongly. We were wrong on both counts. The humans aren't weak. They were restrained. There's a difference, and we've just learned it the hard way. 6,000 light-years away, in a mobile command center that jumped to a new location every 6 hours, Admiral Hawthorne reviewed the reports from his task force commanders. The raids were proceeding better than projected. Zatharian defenses had proven completely unprepared for the speed and ferocity of human tactics. The enemy kept expecting them to follow Council rules of engagement, giving warnings and opportunities to surrender, limiting weapons to non-lethal options whenever possible. Instead, the human fleets hit fast, destroyed their targets completely, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. They were applying lessons learned from Earth's own military history, strategies refined through centuries of human-on-human warfare before first contact with alien species. The galaxy had never seen this kind of combat before because the Council's rules had been designed to prevent it. Admiral, incoming transmission from Council headquarters. They're patching through a Zatharian negotiator. Hawthorne considered refusing the call, but curiosity won out. Put it through. The face that appeared on his screen belonged to High Commander Zelthar. The Zatharian's skin had lost some of its normal color, and his posture suggested exhaustion and stress. Good. Admiral Hawthorne, I am authorized by the Collective's leadership to discuss terms for an immediate ceasefire. I'm listening, Hawthorne said neutrally. The Collective acknowledges that the Harvest Moon incident was handled improperly. We are prepared to pay reparations to the victims' families and accept Council sanctions for our conduct. In exchange, humanity must cease all military operations and return to the Council framework. Hawthorne laughed, a short, bitter sound. You're offering to accept the same slap on the wrist that the Council was already moving toward giving you, in exchange for us stopping the only thing that actually seems to be getting your attention. That's not much of a negotiation, High Commander. What do you want? Zelthar's voice carried genuine confusion, as if he truly couldn't understand what would satisfy humanity's anger. I want those 23,000 people alive again, Hawthorne said quietly. But since I can't have that, I'll settle for making sure you and every other species in the galaxy understands that human lives have value, that you can't murder us and hide behind Council procedures, that there are real, immediate, and devastating consequences for attacking humanity. You've made your point, Zelthar replied. The entire galaxy is watching. They see what you're capable of. You've demonstrated human strength. Now show human wisdom and stop before this spirals into a war that could consume us all. Human wisdom, Hawthorne repeated. Let me tell you about human wisdom, High Commander. For thousands of years, my species believed in something called proportional response. An eye for an eye. You hit us, we hit you back. Sounds fair, right? But there was a problem with that philosophy. If you took my eye and I took yours, we'd both end up blind, but we'd also both end up thinking we came out even. No real deterrent to starting the fight in the first place. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Zelthar's. So humanity learned a different lesson through a lot of hard experience. If you hit us, we don't hit you back equally. We hit you 10 times harder. We hit you so hard that you never even think about hitting us again. And everyone watching learns the same lesson. That's not barbarism, High Commander. That's effective deterrence. The Council will never accept that doctrine, Zelthar said, but his voice had lost its certainty. The Council doesn't have to accept it. They just have to live with it. Here's what's going to happen, High Commander. You're going to pay reparations to every single family that lost someone on Harvest Moon. Not a token amount either. I want enough money that those families never have to work another day in their lives if they choose not to. You're going to surrender the names and locations of every officer involved in planning and executing the Harvest Moon attack. They will face trial under human law, not council law. The collective will never surrender its officers to foreign justice, Zelthar protested. Then my fleets will keep taking apart your military infrastructure until you change your mind, Hawthorne replied calmly. We've hit 6 targets in the past 50 hours. I have preliminary plans for 43 more. I can keep this up for months if necessary. My people are highly motivated, High Commander. Every one of them knows someone who died on Harvest Moon, or knows someone who knows someone. They're not going to get tired of this mission. The transmission fell silent for a long moment. Hawthorne could almost see the calculations happening behind Zelthar's eyes, the Zetharian commander trying to find some angle, some leverage he could use. What guarantee do we have that meeting your demands will end this? Zelthar finally asked. You have my word as an officer, Hawthorne said. Once reparations are paid and the responsible parties are surrendered for trial, Earth will cease offensive military operations against the collective. We'll withdraw to our own space and leave you alone. But I want to be very clear about something, High Commander. This is a one-time settlement. If anyone, Zetharian or otherwise, attacks human interests again, we won't file council complaints or wait for diplomatic solutions. We'll respond immediately and overwhelmingly. The civilized rules are optional for us now. We'll follow them when others do. But the moment someone decides those rules don't apply to humans, they stop applying to everyone. The transmission ended. Hawthorne sat back in his chair, feeling every one of his 53 years pressing down on him. Commander Lee approached quietly. Do you think he'll agree to the terms, sir? Eventually, Hawthorne replied. He doesn't have much choice. We've demonstrated that we can hurt them badly, and that we're willing to keep doing it. The Council isn't going to intervene militarily because none of them want to test whether we'd really extend this campaign to their territory. So the Zetharians will pay because it's cheaper and safer than continuing to fight. And after that, sir, once we've set this precedent? Hawthorne looked at the tactical display, thinking about the question. Humanity had just announced to the galaxy that they were no longer bound by the careful rules and conventions that had kept interspecies conflict manageable for millennia. Some species would see that as dangerous. Others might see it as an opportunity, a new model for dealing with threats. After that, Commander, the galaxy will be a different place. More dangerous in some ways, perhaps, but also more honest. The Council's rules only worked because everyone pretended they mattered even when they didn't. We've stopped pretending. Maybe that will force others to stop pretending too. In the aftermath of Admiral Hawthorne's ultimatum, the Council convened an emergency session for the 3rd time in as many days. The mood in the chamber had shifted dramatically from the previous meetings. Where there had been outrage and demands for human accountability, now there was calculation and careful diplomacy. Ambassador Tvek took the floor, his posture suggesting careful consideration rather than righteous anger. The Council faces a fundamental question about the future of galactic governance. Humanity has rejected our authority and demonstrated the capacity to operate as an independent military power. We must decide how to respond to this challenge. The Kelthan ambassador, a being named Vortal who rarely spoke in council sessions, raised a manipulator appendage for recognition. Before we discuss responses, perhaps we should acknowledge some uncomfortable truths. The humans did not leave the council because they disagreed with our rules in principle. They left because those rules failed to protect them when they needed protection most. The Zatharian attack on Harvest Moon was clearly illegal under council law. Yet our response has been to form committees and schedule hearings weeks in the future. Can we honestly say the humans were wrong to seek faster justice? The humans committed war crimes, Shelthar protested weakly, but his words lacked conviction now. Everyone in the chamber could see what was coming. Did they? Vortal pressed. They attacked military targets belonging to the very forces that destroyed one of their colonies. They used overwhelming force and gave no quarter, tactics that violate council conventions but hardly constitute war crimes in any absolute moral sense. Humans waged wars like this against each other for thousands of years before joining the council. We convinced them to adopt more civilized methods, but we cannot be surprised when they revert to their historical patterns after our civilized methods fail them. The Velnari elder who had warned the council about humanity decades earlier rose slowly to speak. His species aged differently than most, becoming more crystalline and geometric as the years passed, and his current form suggested he had lived through at least 5 galactic standard centuries. I have been a member of this council for longer than some of your species have been spacefaring, he began, his voice like wind chimes in a storm. I have seen wars and treaties, alliances formed and broken, species rise to prominence and fall into obscurity. And I tell you now, the humans represent something we have not encountered before. They are not stronger than us in technology or numbers, but they have a flexibility of thinking that is deeply unusual. He gestured toward the display showing the current location of the human fleet. Most species, when faced with rules and structures, either accept them or reject them. The humans did something different. They learned our rules perfectly, followed them faithfully, and simultaneously maintained the capacity to abandon them instantly if those rules stopped serving their interests. That is not barbarism. That is sophisticated pragmatism. So, what do you suggest? Tvek asked. That we simply accept human actions without consequences? I suggest we recognize reality, the Velnari elder replied. The humans have the capacity to seriously damage any species they target, and we lack the ability to prevent this without committing to a full-scale war that none of us want. More importantly, their demands are not unreasonable. They want justice for an atrocity committed against them. They want guarantees that such atrocities will have real consequences. These are reasonable positions, even if their methods of enforcing those positions are unconventional. The chamber fell into debate that stretched for hours, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The council issued a formal censure of the Zatharian collective for the Harvest Moon attack and mandated reparations to be paid to the victims' families. The amounts were unprecedented, bankrupting several major Zatharian corporate entities and requiring emergency economic support to prevent the collective's economy from collapsing entirely. The officers responsible for planning and executing the attack were surrendered to human custody, transported in secure vessels to Earth where they would face trial under human law. The trials would be public, broadcast across the galaxy, another message from humanity. This is how we treat those who murder our people. But the most significant outcome wasn't any single decision the Council made. It was the fundamental shift in how every species viewed humanity and their place in galactic politics. The young species that everyone had assumed would mature into just another member of the civilized community had instead forced the community itself to confront assumptions about what civilization meant. Admiral Hawthorne stood on the observation deck of the UHS Indomitable, watching the blue-green sphere of Earth rotating slowly below. The fleet had returned home 3 days earlier, their mission complete. There had been ceremonies and speeches, medals awarded, and condolences offered to the families of the 147 crew members lost in various engagements with Zatharian forces. But for Hawthorne, the most meaningful moment had come when a shuttle arrived from Earth carrying a single passenger. Sarah Chen's grandmother, one of the survivors of Harvest Moon, an elderly woman who had lost her entire family in the attack. She had asked to meet him privately, and Hawthorne had agreed, expecting anger or demands for explanation of why the military hadn't prevented the attack in the first place. Instead, she had simply taken his hand and said, "Thank you for showing them that our children mattered." Now, looking down at humanity's home world, Hawthorne thought about what they had done and what it meant for the future. Humanity had announced to the galaxy that they were no longer the junior species, no longer willing to wait for justice that never came. They had drawn a line and enforced it with the kind of violence that had kept their species alive through millions of years of evolution. Some would call it barbarism, others would call it necessary. Hawthorne thought it was probably both. The door opened behind him, and Ambassador Chen Wei entered. She had taken a leave of absence from diplomatic service, unsure whether humanity would even need diplomats in the new relationship with the Council. Hawthorne had invited her to the fleet return ceremony, and she had accepted. "Beautiful view," she said, moving to stand beside him. "I spent 2 decades representing us to the galaxy, trying to convince them we belonged among the stars. Never imagined it would end like this." "Is it ended?" Hawthorne asked. "Or just beginning?" "Both, maybe. The Council will never see us the same way again. We can't go back to being the civilized junior partners, following their rules and hoping they'll protect us. But we also can't be the rogue species, constantly at war with everyone. We'll have to find some new balance." "What do you think that looks like?" Chen Wei was quiet for a long moment, watching Earth turn beneath them. "I think it looks like respect. Real respect, not the patronizing kind where they pat us on the head and tell us we're doing well for such a young species. They'll respect us because they know what we're capable of when pushed, and maybe, if we're careful, we can use that respect to build something better than what came before." "A lot of people died for that respect," Hawthorne said quietly. "I know. 23,000 on Harvest Moon, 12,000 Zatharians at Zelkara, hundreds more in the various engagements. All of them are on our conscience now. We can't undo that. We can only try to make sure it meant something." They stood together in silence, 2 people who had been at the center of humanity's most dramatic transformation in centuries, watching their homeworld and wondering what came next. Below them, Earth continued its rotation, indifferent to the cosmic significance of what had happened. The same planet that had created humanity through millions of years of brutal natural selection, the same world that had witnessed thousands of years of human history. The same sphere of rock and water and life that had sent its children to the stars. Those children had learned to be civilized. They had learned to follow rules and respect traditions, and participate in the careful dance of galactic diplomacy. But they had never forgotten the lessons Earth had taught them first: adapt, survive, and when something threatens your family, you fight with everything you have. The galaxy had called humanity's bluff, assuming that civilization had fundamentally changed their nature. The galaxy had been wrong. Civilization wasn't something that replaced human nature. It was something humanity chose to add on top of it, like clothes covering skin. And just like clothes, it could be removed when necessary. The Zatharians had removed it for them when they destroyed Harvest Moon. Admiral Hawthorne and his fleet had simply shown the galaxy what humanity looked like underneath. In the months that followed, the new relationship between humanity and the galactic community began to take shape. The Council extended a formal invitation for Earth to return to the organization, under revised terms that gave human interests stronger protection and faster paths to justice. After considerable debate, Earth accepted, but on their own conditions. Human fleets would not be restricted by Council military doctrine. Human laws would take precedence in human space. And most importantly, humanity retained the right to respond to attacks on their interests without waiting for Council approval. Some species protested these conditions as giving humanity special privileges. Others quietly began negotiating similar arrangements for themselves, having learned from humanity's example that the civilized rules were more flexible than anyone had previously acknowledged. Trade resumed, diplomatic relationships were rebuilt, and the machinery of galactic civilization continued its work. But something fundamental had changed. The assumption that all species would eventually converge on a single model of civilized behavior had been shattered. Humanity had demonstrated that there were multiple paths to being a responsible member of the galactic community, and not all of them involved abandoning the capacity for overwhelming violence when necessary. Ambassador Chen Wei, who had returned to diplomatic service after deciding her skills were more valuable than ever, put it best in a speech before the reconvened council. Humanity tried following your rules because we believed in the ideals behind them. When those rules failed to protect us, we didn't abandon those ideals. We just found our own way of enforcing them. The choice has always been yours. Deal with us fairly under civilized rules, and you'll find us to be reliable partners. But remember that civilized rules are optional for us now. We follow them by choice, not necessity. And we can unchoose them anytime someone decides that human lives don't matter. The message was clear, and the galaxy heard it. Humanity had earned their place among the stars not by being the strongest or the most advanced, but by being willing to remind everyone else what real consequences looked like when civilization's rules stopped functioning. High Commander Zelthar, in his forced retirement, sometimes thought about the decisions that had led to this outcome. The casual dismissal of human protests, the assumption that a young species would simply accept whatever treatment the established powers decided to give them. The fundamental miscalculation about what humanity was willing to do when pushed too far. He had learned, like so many others, that the most dangerous enemy isn't the one with the biggest weapons or the largest fleet. It's the one who has both the capability and the willingness to use them, who can switch between civilized negotiation and total war without hesitation, who can be reasonable right up until the moment they decide to stop being reasonable. Humanity had spent 2 centuries being civilized. The galaxy had mistaken that for weakness. The ashes of Zelkara Station stood as a permanent reminder of that mistake, visible to any ship passing through the system, a memorial to the day the galaxy learned that civilized rules only work when everyone follows them, and that humanity had never really needed those rules to survive. They had simply chosen to follow them, until they chose not to. And that choice, more than anything else, was what made humanity truly dangerous.